Consider this your quick reference guide to plant-based sweeteners. We'll be talking about 4 top plant-based no-calorie sweeteners, how they're similar to each other, also how they're different, the science, what the science says about these plant-based sweeteners, and also how to use them.
Yay Networks.
A quick note before we dive into today's podcast. If you like what you hear, I would love for you to subscribe to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, wherever you download your podcast. It would also be incredible if you take a minute to rate and review this podcast. Those things do matter and they really help us. I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. Sugar replacers, and specifically plant-based sweeteners as sugar replacers, these no-calorie or very low-calorie plant-based sweeteners, this is something that I get a lot of questions about. There's a lot of conversation around it. There's new products that we're seeing on shelves each day that we can start incorporating into our own baking and things at home. There's also ingredients that we're seeing on product labels. And these have really opened the door to having natural plant-based sweeteners that don't affect our glucose levels. They don't affect our blood sugar levels, yet they're not artificial sweeteners. So we're not talking about the pink, the yellow, the blue. And so the way that I'll reference these is like plant-based, natural, or low or no calorie sweeteners. And what we'll be talking about today is 4 top sweeteners, monk fruit and stevia, and then also erythritol and allulose. And the first 2 may sound more familiar to you than the second 2, but I'd like you to kind of be versed in all of these because they have some similarities, but they also have a lot of differences, and they really function very differently depending on like how we're choosing to use them. So my intention is for this to be a quick reference guide, but I'll confess it's really hard for me to even think. There's so much backstory and like deeper science that I want to dive into with y'all. So I'm going to talk about these 4. I'm going to get right to it. And then I am going to spend some time talking about some of the other kind of background information and surrounding information on it. But those 4, let's talk about those 4 right off the bat. Monk fruit and stevia, I think they sound the most familiar to people. They're names that seem very easy, very friendly names. And so stevia was one of the first really natural low-calorie sweeteners to come onto the market. And actually years ago, like back when I was in college, I remember seeing stevia at a health food store, but it wasn't near the other sweeteners. So in the sweetener section, all you had, and y'all, I'm 48, so we're talking like back in college, that's a while back. And so in the kind of natural food sections or health food stores, you had, unrefined sugar, or specifically maybe vegan sugar, turbinado, or these other kind of unrefined, maybe agave or honey, but very, very, all of those are still sugar. They all still have the same caloric and carbohydrate and sugar content as sugar, essentially. And so when we talk about those low or very, very low or no calorie sweeteners, stevia was the first to really hit the market. But for years, it was not able to be classified as a sweetener. It had to be classified as a dietary supplement. So in a place like a health food store, and y'all know like way back when I'm talking about, this is like not when you would just walk into Whole Foods and you had all the array. Like maybe you were fortunate enough to have a local health food store that like, a lot of times like family owned, or they were like, you knew the people in there, and it was very much, just kind of more of a local space. And so in talking with people and asking questions and learning, just even back in college and seeing this product called stevia, but it was really interesting to me. I'm like, why is it in the supplement section? So it was like almost where you would buy, maybe not necessarily like your vitamin C and D, but sort of in that space. So when I say supplements, that's what I mean. Like think like where you would buy your fish oil or where you would buy other supplements in that space. That's where it was, not near the other sweeteners. And so over time with testing and showing safety, it is now allowed, it's what's considered generally recognized as safe. It can be, and that's just sort of a designation for like many, many, many ingredients. It has to have that designation to be able to be identified or labeled as something like a sweetener that just is going into the regular food supply. So it took a while for it to go from that supplement section to the sweetener section. And so when it did, though, that was sort of the first one that arrived on shelves. And so stevia is available in the powder form or droplet form. And people often, the first that I kind of, knew of people enjoying it or kind of liking how they were choosing to use it is putting a few drops of stevia in their coffee or their tea. That would kind of be an easy one. Here's the thing though, stevia is hundreds of times sweeter than sugar. And so when you're looking at how do you use it in something like baking, it's so much sweeter. It's between 2 and 300 times sweeter typically than table sugar. So it doesn't have a lot of bulk. So if you can imagine something like Equal or Sweet and Low or also Splenda, those are also those really intense, like ultra sweet sweeteners. And you're only using a little bit of them to sweeten just like you would sugar. So stevia, while it has worked really well in something like coffee or tea with just a little drop, if you add too much, people immediately would be like, oh my gosh, I can only add like one drop to, whatever this, I don't know, tall glass of iced tea would be or a coffee, because more than that, they were perceiving it as bitter. And the reason being that stevia is like 200 times sweeter than sugar, at least 200 to 300 times sweeter. So stevia was around for a while and it was sort of like the only show in town. And then another that has really joined the, side by side with stevia is monk fruit. You'll also see it as Lohan or sometimes Lohan Guo. The first time that I ever saw that was also, again, years ago. The founder of Smoothie King, so like the very first Smoothie King that was opened actually here in the greater New Orleans area, but years and years ago, he started experimenting with Lohan Guo as a natural plant-based no-calorie sweetener. And it was, that's the first I knew of it. That was probably 20 plus years ago. And so now the common name for it that we use is monk fruit. And that monk fruit extract also about 200 times sweeter than sugar. So I would put monk fruit and stevia kind of in that same category. So they're the really high intensity sweeteners, 200 plus times sweeter than sugar. So using a little bit of them is going to go a long way. People do like either of these, monk fruit or stevia can go again in coffee or tea or something where you're using just a little bit to add that sweetness. Where these don't work, at least not on their own, is a standalone sugar replacer. And so when we look at something like sugar in baking, sugar is really bulky. There's a lot of volume to sugar. So sugar sweetens a product. Let's talk about baked goods for a minute. So if you're talking about a cookie or something like this, that sugar is going to sweeten it. That sugar also brings moisture. It holds moisture into that baked good. And it also gives that caramelization, that browning on the top of it. So sugar does a whole lot in a baked good beyond just sweetening it. And again, it's really bulky. So when we talk about stevia or monk fruit, they're 200 or more times sweeter than sugar. Well, if a recipe called for a cup of sugar, you would achieve essentially the same sweetness with less than a teaspoon of monk fruit or stevia. And so the volume is not there, but you're to get that sweetness. So you're also not going to have anything that's bringing that moisture, that bulk, giving that caramelization, that browning. So if you're going to use monk fruit or stevia just alone in baking, it's not going to work out. It doesn't do the things in baked goods that you need that bulk or that volume of sugar to do. And so that's where these other two come in. These other two products that we were talking about, I mentioned earlier, there's four top ones that we're going to talk about. There's a lot more, but again, this is your quick reference guide. I'm going to link to some of those other podcasts that take a really deep dive into these. But the other two sweeteners are allulose and also erythritol. And we'll talk about the differences between these. But while stevia and monk fruit are super, super, super sweet, really concentrated, you're going to use just that little dab of it to get that sweetness. Allulose and erythritol are closer to the sweetness of sugar. Technically, they're both about 70% as sweet as sugar. I've seen it ranked anywhere between 60 and 70% as sweet as sugar. So if you have, they're close to a 1-to-1 ratio. For the most part, if you have a cup of sugar and you replace it with a cup of erythritol or a cup of allulose, you're probably going to be pleased with the outcome. It might be just a tad less sweet, but it's again one of those things that training our taste buds anyway to not have so much like sweet, sweet, sweet. It's not necessarily a bad thing, you know? So try it. But I would say for erythritol and allulose, while technically it's not exactly a 1-to-1 ratio, you can typically still use them as a 1-to-1 ratio. You may notice the finished product is just a little bit less sweet, but that might be something that you still actually find enjoyable. So those two, erythritol and allulose, like the other two, like stevia and monk fruit, these are both plant-based natural sweeteners. And so they're different from each other. The erythritol is actually what's called a sugar alcohol. Some of the other types of sugar alcohols are things like sorbitol, maltitol, mannitol, and some of those. They can really cause a lot of stomach upset in a lot of people. And so if sugar alcohols have kind of been on your radar to avoid for that reason, erythritol is one that is much less likely to cause stomach upset. It's digested differently and than the other types of sugar alcohols. So, of all of them, it actually is going to have the least types of the GI side effects. So, looking at these two products, erythritol and allulose, kind of same, you know, looking at these as similar as they're both lower intensity sweeteners. Erythritol is that sugar alcohol. Allulose is interesting. Allulose is not a sugar alcohol. It is actually a sugar that occurs like in really, really small amounts in foods like maple syrup or brown sugar, but hardly any of it is broken down by the body. So it adds that sweetness, but we're digesting very, very little of it. It's basically just passing through undigested. So while allulose is not a sugar alcohol in the same way that erythritol is, it really behaves in a very similar way. It's almost very close to 0 calories, very, very minimal impact, if any, on glucose levels, blood sugar levels. And the same goes with erythritol. Some of the brands you'll see erythritol and Swerve. With allulose and Swerve, we have talked about before, but they have a granular, a confectioner style, and also a brown sugar replacer. And then allulose, you'll find it in the granular form, kind of like sugar, granular like that. You can also find it in liquid, and it's sort of like a thinner honey, almost like a little bit of a nectar consistency, really neutral and mild. And so when you look at at allulose or erythritol side by side, these are the two that are going to work best for you in baking. So if you're looking for, okay, what's my sugar replacer in my baked goods, allulose and or erythritol are your best bets. If you use these in your baked good and you decide, gosh, it's just not quite sweet enough, which try it first because you might surprise yourself and that's often not going to be the case, but try it. If you did need more sweetness, you could either increase the amount of allulose or erythritol or keep that the same and add just a smallest bit of monk fruit or stevia. So monk fruit, typically when we see it in products, it's not the only sweetener. It's a sweetener in addition to something like allulose or erythritol. So they're using that allulose and the erythritol to give the bulk, the volume, all of that. And then the monk fruit just kind of like helps to up the game and the sweetness. So when we look at allulose versus erythritol and how they're different, one of the main, well, there's two main spaces I would say you'll notice a difference. The biggest one that I see is in baked goods, the moisture effect. Allulose holds a lot more moisture than erythritol does. And so what that means is if you're baking with allulose, let's say you have one cookie and you've got, you do one batch with erythritol only, the other batch with allulose only. The one with allulose is going to be much more kind of gooey, a lot denser texture. It's going to hold a lot more moisture in there. The one with Swerve only is going to still have it's bringing that moisture, but just not quite as much as allulose. It's going to brown more. The allulose only, you may find it doesn't brown so much. So the Swerve or the erythritol only would be a little drier, probably a little browner, also a little harder, a little more of a snap to that cookie. The allulose one is going to be a chewier, maybe denser, a higher moisture content. So what you can often find is that going with a blend of both can work really well. And that's almost always my preference. I'll find often like 2/3 erythritol, 1/3 allulose. If you want that higher moisture content, go more like 50-50. But in the podcast that we did called The Art and Science of Plant-Based Sweeteners and Gluten-Free Flours, again, I'll link to it. We had one of our chefs who we hosted a day-long workshop for our Eat Fit chefs about this, about plant-based sweeteners and also baking with gluten-free flours. And one of the experts, a professor at the New Orleans Culinary and Hospitality Institute, he had done an experiment, a sorbet experiment with allulose and erythritol. And the one that was just erythritol, the appearance of the sorbet had a little bit of that a dry, crumbly look. And the one that was a blend of allulose and erythritol had just this beautiful, creamy effect to that sorbet. So as we're looking at stevia and monk fruit, think really, really intense sweeteners, high intensity sweeteners, over 200 times sweeter than sugar. So they're not what you're going to use as a sugar replacer in baking. Allulose and erythritol, very much closer to a 1-to-1 sweetener with sugar. Technically, they're 70%-ish as sweet as sugar. But again, most people the perception that we have of that is very close to a 1-to-1 sweetener. So if you are baking, allulose and erythritol can be your replacers, your sugar replacers in baking. When you need that volume, you need those other functions of sugar. And then as we look at the two and how they differ, that erythritol is going to leave that product a little drier, more of that snap in a cookie, if we're going to use that example, and a little more browning. That allulose brings more moisture to it. So that's kind of the thinking of those four products and the two different categories: really high intensity, your stevia, your monk fruit; lower intensity, like sugar, allulose and erythritol. And then if you're baking, those differences between allulose and erythritol. One of the other things that, as we were working on our book, Craft, the Eat Fit Guide to Zero Proof Cocktails, we really spent a lot of time trying to perfect a zero sugar simple syrup recipe. And we really like using erythritol in it. And we also really like using allulose as a simple syrup. Both of those, I would say, are very also neutral. They don't have a strong aftertaste like stevia or monk fruit does. What we found with monk fruit, if you try to make your own simple syrup with that, it almost tastes like saccharin water. I find people who like sweet and low a lot really like the taste of something like monk fruit or stevia because it's that higher intensity. We found if you're making something like a simple syrup, using those lower intensity sweeteners like allulose and erythritol work best. I mentioned though that allulose holds that moisture differently in a baked good. It does the same in a simple syrup. And so what's really, I think it's just fascinating to look at, or just to notice or observe, is when we did the simple syrup with allulose and we stuck it in the fridge, it can stay there for weeks and it doesn't settle out. So we're using granular allulose like sugar, making that simple syrup with it. It tastes delicious. It's sweet, but it doesn't have any type of a real strong or bitter aftertaste, and it doesn't settle out. When we use the erythritol to make that simple syrup, it's also delicious, like in a drink, as simple syrup would be, and does all of it provides the same benefits and same functions that we expect a simple syrup. But if you let it sit for a little bit, even a short window of time, that erythritol starts to settle out and it starts to crystallize on the bottom of the container that you're holding that simple syrup in. So when we make them, we'll do the simple syrups. We put them in a ball jar. You can have it just plain. You could infuse ginger or rosemary or whatever you wanted to do. And then we like to just, keep it in the fridge. You've got it there. You can use it for, weeks. And so if you did it with the erythritol, that's fine, but know that you'll have to heat it back up and basically redissolve a little bit of that erythritol that settles out. Whereas that allulose, even that granular allulose, it doesn't settle out. It stays in suspension. So those are some of the biggest differences. If you're using it in something that's going to be liquid, then I would recommend going with the allulose because it doesn't settle and it'll stay in suspension. Allulose, I mentioned just briefly earlier, it's available in granular form like sugar. It's also available in that liquid form like a nectar or a honey, kind of a thinner honey consistency. Our chef at Fuel Cafe at Oshner Fitness Center, Ryan Kahn, he has just finished a really cool recipe that's going to go into our new edition of the Eat Fit cookbook. So our first book was a food-based cookbook, the Eat Fit cookbook. We're going to be republishing it at the end of the year. We've got about 20 new recipes that the publisher is allowing us to add into it. And so he has just perfected this really delicious curry chicken salad, and he made a mango chutney to go into this curry chicken salad. And you can do store-bought mango chutney, but it's typically going to be sweetened with added sugar. And so he used the allulose in it, and it just worked really well. And again, allulose, you could almost say there's no aftertaste. If you really, really really paid attention to it, or you knew it was there, you may say that you picked up on an aftertaste, but almost anyone who we kind of do these different taste tests and sweetener taste tests and things like that, very, very, very little. And I could feel comfortable in saying no aftertaste with the allulose and very little with the erythritol. As you get to that stevia and monk fruit, that's not the case. They can be really bitter. If you just stuck your finger in it and kind of touch it to your tongue, it would feel again like you were doing that with like Equal or Sweet and Low. So there's a nutrition, sort of a wellness publication that I really like. It's called Nutrition Action. It's published by the Center for Science and the Public Interest, and they don't take advertising. They don't accept any advertising. It is really it's an easy read. It's not like it's a scientific journal. It's designed for the layperson. They present information in really easy ways they communicate it really, really well. And they had in their March issue of Nutrition Action a really great summary of low calorie sweeteners and these plant-based low calorie sweeteners specifically. They cover more, but I'm going to kind of hit on a few things that I thought were interesting that they noted in kind of their review of these. There was one study that they talked about that was funded by the dairy industry, and people rated yogurt that was sweetened with allulose as good as yogurt sweetened with table sugar. And so they also said that not only did they like the allulose sweetened yogurt as much as the one sweetened with regular table sugar, they also said it didn't have the aftertaste that they picked up on with stevia or Splenda. So just kind of reiterating what we're talking about there, pretty neutral. The one concern or the one issue that most people would have with allulose is if you have a lot, it can cause gastrointestinal upset. And that's because, like we said, it passes through our bodies really without being digested, which is how it's being so low calorie. But looking at a study where researchers fed, doses and going higher and higher in doses to just under 30 people, when they looked at what caused symptoms, kind of that threshold for symptoms, it was about 27 grams of allulose. And a serving of like a high protein cereal. There's a high protein cereal called Magic Spoon that they referenced in here, and that has 10 grams of allulose. So it's just a small study, but looking at it to kind of really what that's going to come down to is many foods sweetened with something like allulose or also erythritol. If you have a serving of that food, many people, you'll find that you're just fine. But if you're like, oh, but it doesn't have, added sugar, it's really low sugar, it's low calorie, and you're having 2, 3, 4 or more servings, you're upping your odds of having that gastrointestinal upset. So while everyone's different and some people could have just a bite of it and it's going to cause them that upset stomach, for most people, if you have what would be considered just a normal serving, like that's sweetened with a normal amount of allulose or erythritol, many people, or I would even say most people, you're going to be fine with that one serving. But as they have more and more, that's where the GI upset would happen. Now, a couple of other things on these types of sweeteners. One thing that's interesting, if you're baking with them and you're plugging in the nutrition information to like, a MyFitnessPal or something like that, and you're looking at the carbs, you can subtract the carbs that come from allulose or erythritol. You can subtract those carbs from your total carb count. The same applies to if you had something like an ice cream that's sweetened with one of these. If you had, let's say, a protein bar Or a good example is Lily's chocolate bars. They're sweetened with these, and they actually list it on the label. It'll tell you that it has, I believe they list it specifically as erythritol on the label. And so, for example, if you're eating something and that label tells you, or your nutrition facts analysis tells you, let's just say 30 grams of total carbs, and you see that there's 10 grams of erythritol in there, you can subtract that 10 grams of erythritol from your total grams of carbs. You can also subtract fiber. So the Lily's bar, I actually just recorded a TV segment this week. It's going to air in a few weeks. And we talked about a friend of mine on the TV segment. I said, a friend of mine, let's call him Nelson, but I'll share with y'all, his name is Nelson. It was a heated discussion about these plant-based sweeteners. It was actually just last weekend. And I was sharing with him about the Lily's chocolate, and that, he's type 1 diabetic, and he's very open about it. I'm not, sharing anything he wouldn't share otherwise, but he has type 1 diabetes. He was diagnosed about 15 years ago. He and several other people actually were really close with were otherwise healthy, their entire lives. And then as adults, they were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And the thought is that it was a virus that attacked their pancreas. And so they went their whole life living a very, active, healthy life as athletes and such. And then all of a sudden, switching. And so having to learn and educate as an adult and become very familiar with that for type 1 diabetes, because their bodies produce no insulin. So we were talking about the Lily's chocolate was the example that we were looking at. And he was looking at the particular bar, and it was 38 grams of carbohydrate, but then there was a lot of fiber in there. And then it also listed how much was the erythritol. And so in the entire bar, it looked like 38 grams of carbs. But then once you subtracted the fiber and you also subtracted the grams of carbs from your erythritol, it actually left you with 6. So that 38 grams of carbs minus the fiber, minus the erythritol was 6. And he was really like, yeah, but that's not the case for me because I have type 1 diabetes. I don't have a pancreas. I'm not producing insulin. And he was so set on looking at total carbs because that's what he had been taught. That's what he knew, is that total carbs. And so the idea that something could be classified as a carbohydrate and show up in those total carbohydrates on the label, but not digested and absorbed like a carbohydrate, felt very strange to him. And he was so doubtful on it, understandably. But that's the case. So fiber is classed as a dietary carbohydrate. But like allulose, fiber is not digested. Fiber passes through essentially undigested. And same with something like allulose, or this erythritol has a very low calorie impact. So we can take that total carbs and we can subtract the fiber. We can subtract the sugar alcohol or the erythritol. And so, but he was really, really doubtful. And so we did an experiment on him. So this is a really scientific experiment, y'all, with a population, a study of 1, and a sample size of 1. But it was interesting. So next time we saw him was in the morning, and he was kind of steady state. He hadn't eaten for the past few hours. He was checking his glucose levels, and that he was sure that if he ate this chocolate bar with what was going to be that volume of carbohydrate, the 38 grams of carbohydrate, he was like, this would normally increase his blood sugar level by about 50 points. And he was certain that it would go up 50 points. And his glucose was already running a little bit high. It was 180, so for him high. But it had been that for a couple of hours, so he was kind of just like in a steady state. It was 180. So he was sure it was actually 181. He was sure it was going to go up 50 points, so we'd say, 231. So he has this bar, chocolate bar, ends up eating about half of it. So he's still like, it's going to go over 200 though. And 45 minutes passes, he checks it, then continues to check it several times after. Y'all, it dropped. It dropped 1 point. So it dropped from 181 to 180. And it was stunning to him. And he was like, there's no way that I just ate half of a chocolate bar that essentially on the label would say about 20 grams of carbs and it had no impact on me. And that was because it has the fiber in there. And it was dark chocolate. It's got the fiber in there, but then it also has these plant-based sweeteners. So they're classed as carbs. They're going to show up on the label as carbs. They're going to show up in that total carb count, but you can subtract them. So it can be a little bit confusing, but just, you'll turn over a few of those labels, start to look at it. And if you're not familiar with it, you'll see what we're talking about there. So a couple of last things in this space. As you're at the store, you're scanning shelves, or if you're depending on where you live, you may see a good selection of these things at a place like a Whole Foods or your local natural food store, or you may be looking online. But those four, monk fruit and stevia, and then but for baking specifically allulose and erythritol. As you're looking at these, some of it's going to depend on price point. It's going to depend on availability. What I would say about all of these though is if you're using such high amounts of these, or if you're purchasing pre-made foods like the ice cream or the chocolate bars that are sweetened with these, cereals, all of this kind of stuff, yogurts, we could go on, oatmeal, how much is the food you're eating? How much does that food actually taste like the food it's supposed to taste like versus some version of still this ultra sweet candy like thing? And so I would encourage all of us that, if we have been having these super, super sweet drinks and baked goods and sweets and snacks, even when we're switching to the plant based sweeteners, let's try to dial it back. And so earlier when I was saying, that the allulose and the erythritol are about 70% as sweet as sugar. So they're a little bit less than a 1-to-1, but you could usually use them in baking in about a 1-to-1. Part of that objective is to try to get us to get more accustomed to things and retrain our taste buds for things that aren't quite so sweet, sweet, sweet. And then over time, it's helping us to really appreciate the foods for what that food is. And so, the person who says, "Oh my gosh, I can't stand the way that plain Greek yogurt tastes." I love like the low fat, but not the fat free Greek yogurt. I think the low fat or even the 4% fat plain Greek yogurt, I love it. I find that the versions with the fat in it, the low fat or the 4% fat, they're so much creamier and they just have such a better even flavor than the fat free version. So if you're doubtful or you're a little bit of a hater in the plain Greek yogurt space, if you've only tried the fat free plain Greek yogurt, just humor me and try the 2% or even the 4% plain Greek yogurt. See what you think. Because I find that the texture and just everything about it, the creaminess, I just think it's even better, or I would say way better than the fat free. But anyway, if you're not even close to that, if you've been having the flavored, let's say like Dannon style yogurts that are really sugary sweet, if you've been having the sugar sweetened ones, or you've been having the ones sweetened with like Splenda or whatever it is, if you're doing that and then you're trying to go to plain unsweetened yogurt, that's a big leap. But if you start to gradually dial back the sweetener that you're using, or we could use the same example. If you're putting like a lot of a sweetener in your tea or coffee, that's something that you have easy control over. You can kind of start to dial back how much sweetener you're adding. And gradually you're getting to where, again, we're retraining our taste buds. And so as we start to do this with more and more types of foods that we're reaching for, if you're a baker and you're doing it at home, again, using less of the sweetener, even if it's a plant-based natural one that we're talking about, that doesn't mean that we need to go, just overboard with it just because it's low calorie or low sugar. So still being mindful of dialing it back, retraining our taste buds. And then over time, the person who was the Dannon sugary sweet, sweet, sweet yogurt, ultimately, often we do hear the stories of people who over time, and it does take some time, but they actually get into a space where they're like, wow, I love the lower fat plain Greek yogurt. And they never would have thought they'd get there. So, but it's possible. But all of it starts with really being mindful of what we're reaching for. So I'd say these four sweeteners, I like them a lot. I think they definitely have a place. I like that more food companies are sweetening their products with them instead of sugar or instead of artificial sweeteners. Also like that they're available in stores more readily so that we can purchase them for baking or sweetening and things that we're adding on our own. But ultimately, I'd say even though these are natural, plant-based, low calorie, all of these things, essentially very, very low impact on our glucose levels, if at all of that aside, how much are you using and how much do you really need to use? So kind of, again, rethinking our habits there. And ultimately, the good news is these options exist. So for years, it was sugar. or varieties of sugar. And if we wanted it to be not sugar, it was saccharin in the form of sweet and low. It was aspartame in the form of equal, or it was sucralose in the form of Splenda. So we only had the option of sugar, that's just sugar, 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 or these artificial sweeteners that don't exist in nature. So the fact that we do have now these natural plant-based sweeteners that are very low or no calorie, and they function differently, and they kind of give us the variety of options to use in different foods. But ultimately, the fact that we have these options is a beautiful thing. So for years, we had either just sugar, or if we wanted something that wasn't sugar, it was the artificial sweeteners, the pink, the yellow, the blue. So the fact that now we have these plant-based natural sweeteners that function differently, they have different benefits, they have different uses, different applications. But the fact that we have this variety of options in products that we're buying at the stores or things that we can make ourselves at home, again, I think this is a wonderful step forward to increasing our awareness and increasing the options for us. So I hope this has been helpful for y'all. I know there's a lot happening in this space. There's constantly new products coming out, there's new research, there's new reports. And so this is kind of the quick and dirty summary of these. Again, as I talked about, I'll be linking to past episodes that we've covered in even more detail in the show notes of this episode so that you can hear the chefs weighing in on this topic. You can hear us kind of taking a deeper dive with food scientists, all types of other experts on it. But again, wanted something that's sort of that quick rundown for y'all, that quick reference point. As always, as you incorporate any of this into your own life, I would always love to hear about it. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you'd like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com. You can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.